Where did it come from? Where did the ideas come from? And for me, really, writing stories is kind of like what we used to do when we were kids. And now, when I'm with younger kids in high school and try to explain this, sometimes they just look at me like they don't know what I'm talking about. But what we did when we were kids was, if we read something in a book or saw it on TV, the next day we were outside in the yard and we were making our little playhouses. We used to rake the pine needles and outline our rooms, and the picnic table was a Conestoga wagon, and the benches were horses, and we, and it was funny because nobody had to tell us kids how to make up a story. We just did it naturally. And if it was time to go to the store, you made your mind up what kind of horse you rode or what kind of car you drove. And if it was time to go pick up the kids at school, you made your mind up how many kids you had and what their names were and stuff. And and they surprisingly got in trouble for a lot of the stuff you got in trouble with your mother. So it proves that old curse true, or your mom says, I hope one of these days you have a kid just like you. And you pretend that when you're young. But anyway, that's what we did. And nobody worried about us. As long as we were in by the time the street lights came on, that was fine. We ran the whole neighborhood, and you'd hear the mom calls crossing the neighborhood. Sometimes that was before cell phones, so the moms would just yell. And so around dinner time, you'd hear the mom yells going across the neighborhood. And so for me, writing is still a lot like that. It's just like when we used to go out and play Let's Pretend with all those imaginary friends and places, and it was all very real to us, and it still is to me, which I'm sure means I need therapy. So I just never outgrew that, is what's going on. But my husband's Uncle Pug had my favorite ever quote about that. He said, some of the best adventures of my life never really happened. And that's the truth for me. A lot of the best adventures of my life never really happened, except in my mind, or in a book I read, or in a story I wrote. And so for me, the natural extension of that was just to start writing stories about things I saw or heard. And I was always writing stories when I was young, and a lot of the times it was because I wished something was different, and I could write a story and I could make that something happen differently. I could win the foot race at school instead of being third place or whatever, if I rewrote it. And so I was always doing stuff like that. And for me, anything can inspire a story. And these days, so many of the inspirations come from life and all over, just anywhere. But the first book for me actually was inspired by my grandmother, and I know you've had a book review of it, so I thought you'd probably enjoy hearing a little more about where Tending Roses came from. That book, to really understand that book, you have to understand just a little bit about my grandmother and I. Because my grandmother and I came from two very different worlds. My grandmother came from a small town during the Great Depression and grew up in a very, very poor family where kids kind of came one right after the other, and she was one of the older ones, so she was charged with caring for these younger kids. And I grew up in a small town during the, just kind of regular average times, and in a suburban neighborhood, and my grandmother was the kind of person who saved everything from mayonnaise jars to chicken livers. And I grew up in this throwaway culture where, we didn't save stuff. If something broke, we just threw it out and bought new stuff. And sometimes we threw stuff out just because we didn't like it anymore and we wanted to buy new stuff. And my grandmother had a lot to say about that kind of thing. She used to say things like, the man who buys what he does not need will one day need what he cannot buy. And as kids, I have to say, we didn't really get it. We just thought that she was really bored and old and fussy, and that lecturing us was a form of entertainment for her, because she didn't have anything better to do. And she had lectures for every subject. If we didn't want to eat what was on the table. My grandmother did not care that the psychologists tell you not to force feed a kid, because all my grandmother cared about was waste was a sin. And she would say, be grateful, young lady, you could be starving in a hut in Africa right now. If we didn't want to go to school, she would tell us, we should be grateful to have school. If we didn't want to catch the school bus, she would tell us, how she had walked 5 miles on foot in the snow, dragging 5 brothers and sisters behind her, and she was glad to do it, young lady. But what I never knew about my grandmother, because a lot of times, I loved my grandmother, but my grandmother could make you so glad to be leaving after a visit to farm. And then you'd look in the rearview mirror and she would be on the steps dabbing her eyes because she was crying because we were going and we lived a long ways away and she wasn't going to see us till usually the next year. And what I never understood about her, because a lot of times when you don't like somebody, it's because you don't know where they're coming from. And my grandmother, like a lot of Depression-era people, didn't talk about where she had come from. She felt she had risen above it, moved beyond it. She didn't want to talk about it. She very much looked down on people who had less than she had achieved as being too lazy and slovenly sort of to have come up to where she had raised herself to in life. And so I never knew where my grandmother had come from until my first son was born, and she came to stay with me when the baby was very little. And he was a rock star from day one because he was the first one in the family in forever. First baby of my generation, basically, and I was one of the younger grandkids, so the others just weren't very good producers early on. And so it was a big deal, and my grandmother came to stay with me and to see the baby, and the first thing she started doing was handing out unsolicited parenting advice that was about 50 years out of date. And she didn't care what the books said now, she knew how it should be done. And so we decided that what we would do together was plant gardens around my house. We had this sort of new starter house, and so we were planting gardens one day, and the baby got fussy. And we had to go inside, and I was frustrated because at 20-something, I wanted it done now, and if it didn't happen on my little timetable, I just thought it was wrong. And my grandmother took the baby, and we went inside, and she told me to hush, and when my grandmother told you to hush, you hush.